The SEAL's chart read like a textbook case of perfect recovery. Heart rate, 50 beats per minute, steady as a metronome. Oxygen saturation, locked at 100%. Blood pressure, 120/80, no variation, no drift. The attending physicians called it miraculous. They used words like unprecedented adaptation and elite physiology. They scheduled his discharge for 72 hours post-admission. I stood at the observation window and watched him breathe. His chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, each exhalation measured like a calibrated exhaust venting from a sealed system. The rhythm was exact, 8.3 seconds per cycle, but the air didn't move like breath. It moved like data being expelled. His skin held a pallor that no amount of oxygen saturation should allow, a gray undertone that pulsed in time with the monitors. When his eyes opened, they tracked movement with the same geometric precision as his heartbeat, settling on objects with the deliberation of a targeting system, rather than the curiosity of a conscious mind. The attending physician saw a miracle. I saw something else entirely. The data wasn't perfect. It was geometric. Human biology doesn't operate in fixed loops. It breathes, it fluctuates, it responds. This patient's vitals repeated in exact 8.3-second cycles, like a machine maintaining parameters rather than a body sustaining life. The pattern wasn't recovery, it was camouflage. And in 72 hours, when he walked out of isolation, whatever was controlling those vitals would walk out with him. The SEAL arrived unconscious on a classified medevac flight from a depth no combat diver should survive. The mission brief was redacted. The coordinates were redacted. Even the extraction team's names were redacted. What wasn't redacted was the depth marker in his decompression log, 2,400 meters. That's not a dive. That's a descent into pressure that turns nitrogen into a neurotoxin and oxygen into a poison. He should have arrived seizing, hemorrhaging, or dead. Instead, he arrived stable. Within 6 hours of admission, his vitals normalized. Within 12, they perfected. The trauma team celebrated. The base commander called it a testament to SEAL conditioning. The cardiologist wrote a case study draft before the patient even regained consciousness. I stood in the monitoring station and watched the telemetry scroll across 4 screens, and I felt the geometry of wrongness settle into my chest. The first anomaly appeared during a routine pain response test. A nurse administered a controlled stimulus to his left foot, a standard neurological assessment. His face didn't change. His breathing didn't shift. His heart rate stayed locked at 50 beats per minute. No spike, no dip, no variation. The nurse repeated the test on the right foot. Same result. She increased the stimulus intensity. Nothing. Human physiology doesn't work that way. Pain triggers the sympathetic nervous system. Heart rate accelerates, blood pressure rises, pupils dilate. This patient's body ignored the input entirely, as if the signal never reached his brain, or as if something else was intercepting it. I requested a 48-hour telemetry review. The attending physician approved it reluctantly, muttering about unnecessary caution. When the data came back, I spread it across my desk and traced the pattern with a ruler. Every vital sign repeated in precise 8.3-second intervals. Heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, all synchronized to a rhythm that didn't exist in nature. I pulled comparison data from our archive. Normal heart rate variability shows micro fluctuations even in trained athletes. A resting pulse might average 50 beats per minute, but it achieves that average through a range, 48, 52, 49, 51, constantly adjusting to oxygen demand, temperature, position, stress. This patient's heart rate didn't average 50, it was 50. Exactly. Every beat, every cycle, for 48 consecutive hours. The lab results confirmed what the telemetry suggested. Cellular respiration was being externally regulated. Mitochondrial function showed efficiency levels 40% above human baseline. Oxygen uptake in muscle tissue exceeded theoretical maximums. His body wasn't recovering from trauma. It was being maintained. I ran the numbers again, checking for equipment malfunction, calibration error, data corruption. The numbers held. I cross-referenced with 3 separate monitoring systems. The pattern repeated across all of them. This wasn't measurement error. This was biological impossibility presenting as clinical perfection. The attending physician dismissed my concerns. "He's a SEAL," he said. "Elite conditioning produces elite results." I showed him the telemetry overlay. He glanced at it for 5 seconds and shrugged. "Looks healthy to me." I requested a cellular assay. He denied it. "The patient is stable and improving. We don't run invasive tests on success stories." That's when I realized the institutional narrative was already written. The base had extracted a high-value operator from an impossible situation. The medical team had stabilized him against all odds. The story was too clean, too heroic, too politically valuable to complicate with questions about synthetic rhythm and algorithmic maintenance. The data suggested miracle. The physics suggested masquerade. And I had 72 hours to prove which one was true before the patient, and whatever was controlling him, walked out the door. The attending physician's dismissal still hung in the air like smoke, sharp, acrid, and suffocating. The hospital had already moved on, preparing the paperwork for a hero's return. But in the spaces between the official narrative and the telemetry data, something darker was breathing. I didn't go home. I went to the one place where the story didn't matter. I isolated myself in the analysis lab for the next 6 hours. No interruptions, no second opinions, just raw data and the kind of silence that lets you hear patterns most people miss. I pulled the full 48-hour telemetry window and fed it into the waveform analyzer, a piece of equipment we normally reserve for arrhythmia diagnosis and pacemaker calibration. The first pass confirmed what I already knew. The 8.3-second cycle was absolute. But the second pass revealed something deeper. The cycle wasn't just consistent, it was algorithmic. Each physiological parameter adjusted in response to the others with mathematical precision. When oxygen saturation dipped by 0.1%, respiratory rate increased by exactly 0.3 breaths per minute. When blood pressure shifted by 2 millimeters of mercury, heart rate compensated with a 0.4 BPM adjustment. The corrections happened within milliseconds, faster than human autonomic response, faster than conscious thought. I overlaid the data with normal heart rate variability charts. A healthy human heart shows chaos, beautiful, organic chaos. Beat-to-beat intervals vary by 20 to 100 milliseconds, depending on breathing, position, stress, digestion. That variability is a sign of health, proof that the autonomic nervous system is responding to thousands of inputs every second. This patient's heart showed 0 variability. Not low variability, 0. The intervals between beats were identical, down to the millisecond. That's not elite conditioning. That's external control. I ran a spectral analysis, looking for frequency signatures that might indicate where the regulation was originating. Normal biological rhythms show harmonic complexity, multiple overlapping frequencies from different organ systems. This patient showed a single dominant frequency at 0.12 Hz, corresponding exactly to the 8.3-second cycle. Everything else was suppressed or synchronized to that primary rhythm. I checked the lab work again. The cellular assay I'd requested had been denied, but the routine blood panel showed anomalies the attending physician had ignored. Lactate levels were too low for someone who'd experienced deep-sea trauma. Cortisol was flatlined. Inflammatory markers were absent. His body wasn't healing from injury. It was being held in stasis. I pulled up the mission debrief, or what little of it wasn't redacted. The SEAL had been exposed to an unknown biological entity at depth. The report used careful language. Potential contact with unidentified organic material. But the implication was clear. Something had gotten into him down there. Something that operated in high-pressure, low-oxygen environments where human physiology breaks down. I started building a hypothesis. The organism needed perfect homeostasis to survive. It couldn't tolerate the fluctuations of normal human biology, the temperature shifts, the pH variations, the oxygen swings. So it took control. It regulated the host's vital signs with the precision of a machine, maintaining conditions optimal for its own survival while keeping the host functional enough to avoid detection. The perfect vitals weren't a sign of recovery. They were a signature, the forensic evidence of an organism maintaining its environment. And if my hypothesis was correct, the 72-hour discharge window wasn't arbitrary. It was a timeline. The organism needed time to adapt from deep-sea pressure to surface conditions, time to complete whatever life cycle stage it was in, time to become transmissible. I ran one final test. I pulled historical data from 3 other patients who'd undergone extreme physiological stress, a near drowning, a severe hypothermia case, a decompression injury. All of them showed the messy, chaotic recovery patterns of normal human biology. Heart rates that spiked and dropped, blood pressure that swung wildly before stabilizing, oxygen saturation that fluctuated as damaged lungs relearned their function. This patient showed none of that. His recovery was a straight line from critical to perfect, with no deviation, no setbacks, no human messiness. It was the cleanest data I'd ever seen. And that's exactly what made it wrong. I saved the analysis and locked the files. Then I did something I'd never done before. I bypassed the attending physician entirely and requested an emergency consultation with the base medical commander. The request form had a single line for justification. I wrote, "Patient vitals indicate non-human regulatory control. Recommend immediate isolation protocol." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. The institutional narrative was about to fracture, and I was the one holding the hammer. The base medical commander arrived within 20 minutes. That told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he took the words non-human regulatory control. He didn't come alone. 2 biosafety officers followed him into the analysis lab, faces already set in the expression of people preparing to contain something they didn't want to acknowledge existed. I walked them through the telemetry data without preamble. The 8.3-second cycle, the zero variability, the algorithmic compensation patterns. The commander listened without interrupting, eyes moving between the screens and my face, calculating whether I was brilliant or delusional. "Show me the mission debrief," he said finally. I pulled up the file. Most of it was black bars and redacted timestamps, but the relevant section was intact. The SEALs team had been conducting a classified survey operation at 2,400 meters when they encountered what the report called an unidentified biological mass. The description was clinical to the point of uselessness. Gelatinous structure approximately 3 meters in diameter, exhibiting bioluminescent properties and active movement patterns inconsistent with known deep-sea fauna. The SEAL had made direct contact during sample collection. His exposure suit had been compromised. The team had aborted the mission and initiated emergency ascent protocols, but the decompression schedule had been rushed, incomplete. By the time they reached the surface, he was unconscious. By the time he reached our facility, his vitals were already stabilizing into that perfect, impossible rhythm. "What are we looking at?" the commander asked. "Parasite? Symbiont?" "Neither," I said, "or both. The organism operates in an environment where human physiology can't function. Extreme pressure, near zero oxygen, temperatures just above freezing. It needs perfect homeostasis to survive at surface conditions. So it's using the host's elite conditioning as camouflage while it adapts." One of the biosafety officers spoke up. "Adapts to what?" I pulled up the cellular efficiency data. The patient's mitochondrial function is 40% above human baseline. Oxygen uptake exceeds theoretical maximums. Those aren't signs of recovery. They're signs of optimization. The organism is modifying the host's cellular respiration to create an environment it can tolerate long-term. "Long-term," the commander repeated. "You're saying it's permanent?" "I'm saying it's preparing for transmission." I showed them the timeline. The patient was exposed 68 hours ago. He's scheduled for discharge in 4 hours. That's not coincidence. The organism needs 72 hours to complete atmospheric pressure adaptation. After that, it becomes viable outside the host. The biosafety officer leaned closer to the screen. "Transmission method?" "Unknown, but given the respiratory optimization patterns, I'd guess airborne or droplet-based. Once the patient reaches full atmospheric equilibrium, every breath he takes could be a vector. The commander straightened. You're telling me we have a walking biohazard scheduled to walk out of here in 4 hours? I'm telling you we have a patient whose body is being borrowed by an organism we don't understand, operating on a timeline we didn't know existed until 20 minutes ago. I met his eyes, and the attending physician just signed his discharge papers. The room went silent, except for the hum of the monitors. The commander looked at the telemetry one more time, watching that perfect 50 beats per minute rhythm scroll across the screen like a countdown clock. Recommend action? He asked. Immediate quarantine. Full isolation protocols. Cancel the discharge and initiate priority override before he reaches the outer facility boundary. Priority override requires evidence of active threat to base population. I gestured at the screens. This is the evidence. The commander nodded slowly. Then he pulled out his radio and made the call that would either save the base or end my career. The radio clicked off, and for 3 seconds, the room held its breath. Then the machinery of the base turned against its own schedule. I could feel it through the floor, a low-frequency hum as ventilation systems switched to isolated circuits and blast doors tested their seals. The countdown had shifted from theoretical to kinetic. The priority override triggered a cascade I hadn't fully anticipated. Within minutes, the facility shifted into lockdown mode. Blast doors sealed. Ventilation systems switched to isolated circuits. Armed security personnel took positions at every corridor junction. And somewhere in that controlled chaos, someone made a phone call that brought the real pressure down on top of me. The Navy liaison arrived 30 minutes after the lockdown initiated. Commander grade, dress uniform, the kind of bearing that suggested he'd spent more time in briefing rooms than operational theaters. He walked into the analysis lab, flanked by 2 officers I didn't recognize, their rank insignia deliberately obscured. Dr. Chen, he said, not bothering with pleasantries. You've initiated a facility-wide biohazard protocol based on what, exactly? Unusual telemetry? I gestured at the screens. Based on evidence of non-human regulatory control of patient vital signs and a 72-hour transmission timeline that ends, I checked my watch, in 3 hours and 40 minutes. Evidence, he repeated. You have telemetry data showing consistent vital signs and a theory about deep-sea organisms. What you don't have is positive identification of a pathogen, confirmed transmission vectors, or any actual proof of threat. The proof is in the pattern. The pattern, he interrupted, shows a patient recovering with remarkable efficiency, the kind of efficiency we expect from our elite operators. He pulled a folder from his briefcase. Do you know who this patient is? I didn't answer. The liaison opened the folder anyway. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 12 years of service, 3 combat deployments, nephew of Admiral Richard Webb, who happens to be overseeing this facility's operational command structure. He closed the folder. The Admiral's office has been briefed on your concerns. They've reviewed the data. Their assessment is that you're seeing anomalies where there are none. Their assessment is wrong. Their assessment, the liaison said, his voice dropping to something harder, is that this facility has already generated significant positive press coverage around Lieutenant Webb's miraculous survival. CNN ran the story this morning. The Secretary of the Navy mentioned it in a briefing. Canceling his discharge now, based on speculative analysis, creates problems that extend well beyond medical protocols. I felt the institutional weight settling onto my shoulders. This wasn't about medicine anymore. It was about narrative control, political optics, career trajectories measured in flag officer promotions. With respect, Commander, I don't care about press coverage. I care about preventing an outbreak. An outbreak of what? You can't even identify the organism. Because you won't authorize the cellular assay I requested 6 hours ago. The liaison's jaw tightened. The patient is conscious now. He's requesting discharge. He's lucid, oriented, showing no signs of distress. You want me to tell a decorated SEAL that he's being held against his will because a specialist thinks his heart beats too regularly? I want you to tell him his body is being used as an incubation chamber by an organism that will become transmissible in, I checked again, 3 hours and 36 minutes. One of the unidentified officers spoke for the first time. Dr. Chen, what's your confidence level on this timeline? I met his eyes. 90%. And the transmission risk? Unknown, but the respiratory optimization patterns suggest airborne or droplet-based vectors. If I'm right, and Lieutenant Webb leaves this facility before we understand what's controlling his vitals, we're looking at potential base-wide exposure within 96 hours. The liaison pulled out his phone. I need to make a call. He stepped into the hallway. Through the glass, I watched him speak rapidly, gesturing with his free hand. The conversation lasted 2 minutes. When he returned, his expression had shifted from dismissive to something closer to resignation. The Admiral wants a direct consultation, he said. You have 15 minutes to present your case. If he's not convinced, the discharge proceeds as scheduled. 15 minutes to convince a flag officer to override political pressure, family loyalty, and institutional momentum. I looked at the monitors one more time, watching that perfect 50 beats per minute rhythm scroll past like a timer counting down to transmission. When? I asked. Now. The Admiral appeared on screen exactly 15 minutes later. No small talk, no rank acknowledgement, just a face that had spent decades making decisions other people had to live with. Behind him, I could see the edge of what looked like a tactical operations center. Multiple screens, personnel moving with purpose, the visual grammar of command authority. Dr. Chen, he said, you have my attention. Use it carefully. I pulled up the telemetry overlay and positioned it where the camera would capture both the data and my face. Sir, your nephew's vital signs are being externally regulated by an organism acquired during deep-sea contact. The regulation follows an 8.3-second algorithmic cycle with zero natural variability. This isn't human physiology. This is something else maintaining optimal conditions for its own survival. I've seen the data. The attending physician says it shows exceptional recovery. The attending physician is reading the conclusion without analyzing the mechanism. Human biology doesn't operate in fixed loops. Even elite operators show heart rate variability, respiratory fluctuation, dynamic blood pressure adjustment. Lieutenant Webb shows none of that. His body is being held in stasis. The Admiral leaned forward slightly. Held by what? An extremophile organism adapted to high-pressure, low-oxygen environments. It made contact with Lieutenant Webb at 2,400 meters. Since then, it's been optimizing his cellular respiration, regulating his homeostasis, preparing for atmospheric adaptation. Preparing for what purpose? I pulled up the timeline projection. Transmission. The organism needs 72 hours to adapt from deep-sea pressure to surface conditions. Lieutenant Webb was exposed 68 hours ago. He's scheduled for discharge in... I checked the countdown I'd started running on a second monitor. 3 hours and 14 minutes. That's not coincidence. That's biology operating on a timeline we didn't know existed until we looked for the pattern. The Admiral's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. What's your evidence for transmission? Respiratory optimization patterns suggest preparation for airborne or droplet-based vectors. Mitochondrial efficiency is 40% above human baseline. That's not recovery, that's modification. The organism is creating an environment it can survive in long term. And once it reaches atmospheric equilibrium, every breath your nephew takes becomes a potential exposure event. Potential, the Admiral repeated. You're asking me to override a discharge, hold a decorated seal against his will, and create a political incident based on potential. I'm asking you to prevent an outbreak based on forensic evidence of non-human biological control. Silence filled the screen. Behind the Admiral, I saw someone hand him a tablet. He glanced at it, then back at me. The base medical commander supports your assessment? Yes, sir. And you're confident in this 72-hour timeline? 90% confident. But sir, if I'm wrong, the worst outcome is we hold Lieutenant Webb for observation and discover I overreacted. If I'm right and we do nothing, we're looking at base-wide exposure within 96 hours. The Admiral set the tablet down. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd made harder decisions than this, and lived with the consequences. Dr. Chen, I've spent 30 years in the Navy. I've lost people to enemy action, equipment failure, and bad luck. I've never lost anyone to a doctor's caution. He paused. Initiate full quarantine protocols. Lieutenant Webb stays in isolation until you can prove the threat is neutralized or non-existent. You have 72 hours to be right. And if the political pressure... I'll handle the political pressure, he said. You handle the biology. Understood? Yes, sir. The screen went dark. I sat in the sudden silence of the analysis lab, feeling the full weight of what I'd just set in motion. Somewhere, 3 floors below, Lieutenant Webb was being moved to the isolation ward. Armed security would be stationed outside. Biohazard protocols would seal him away from the rest of the base, and I had 72 hours to prove I wasn't destroying a man's career over a pattern only I could see. I pulled up the cellular assay request form one more time. This time, nobody would deny it. The countdown continued. 3 hours, 12 minutes. The facility had become a pressure cooker of silence, every corridor echoing with the weight of waiting. I spent those hours in purgatory, watching Lieutenant Webb through isolation ward cameras, his geometric vitals scrolling past like a countdown only I could read. Then the call came. The cellular assay took 4 hours to process. 4 hours of watching Lieutenant Webb through isolation ward cameras, monitoring vitals that refused to deviate, waiting for lab results that would either validate everything I'd risked or prove I'd triggered a facility lockdown over algorithmic coincidence. The lab tech called at 03:47 hours. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering results they didn't want to believe. Dr. Chin, you need to see this. I was already moving. The lab occupied a negative pressure wing designed for exactly this scenario. Unknown biological threats requiring level 4 containment protocols. The tech had the sample spread across 3 workstations, each showing a different magnification level of Lieutenant Webb's blood. At 400 times magnification, the cells looked normal. Red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, all present in expected ratios, all functioning within parameters. At 1,000 times, the first anomalies appeared. Mitochondrial structures showed geometric regularities that didn't exist in nature. The organelles responsible for cellular respiration had been modified, optimized, restructured into configurations that maximized oxygen processing efficiency. At 4,000 times, I saw the organism itself. It wasn't a parasite in any conventional sense. It was integrated into the cellular architecture, existing as a network of filaments that connected mitochondria across multiple cells. The filaments pulsed with bioluminescent markers, the same signatures mentioned in the mission debrief from the deep-sea contact. It's not infecting the cells, the tech said quietly. It's rewiring them. I leaned closer to the monitor. The filament network operated like a distributed nervous system, coordinating cellular function across tissue boundaries. That explained the algorithmic precision of the vital signs. The organism wasn't controlling Lieutenant Webb's autonomic system. It had become his autonomic system. Transmission vectors? I asked. The tech pulled up a second screen showing respiratory tissue samples. The organism had concentrated in the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where oxygen exchange occurs. The filaments formed dense clusters around the epithelial cells, positioning themselves exactly where exhaled breath would carry them into the environment. Airborne, she confirmed, but only after atmospheric pressure equilibrium. The organism is still adapting. Current viability outside the host is approximately 4 hours. She checked her notes, 63 minutes. When the 72-hour adaptation window completes, viability extends to indefinite. I did the math. If Lieutenant Webb had been discharged on schedule, he would have reached the base residential quarters approximately 90 minutes after becoming a viable transmission source. 1 meal in the dining facility, 1 workout in the gym, 1 conversation in a crowded hallway. Conservative modeling suggested 200 to 300 potential exposures within the first 6 hours. Show me the organism's life cycle, I said. The tech pulled up time-lapse imaging from the past 4 hours. The filament network was growing, expanding its integration into Lieutenant Webb's cellular structure. But it wasn't destroying tissue, it was optimizing it. Muscle cells showed enhanced oxygen uptake. Neural tissue demonstrated improved electrical conductivity. Even his immune system had been modified to tolerate the organism's presence without triggering inflammatory response. "It's not killing him," the tech said. "It's improving him." "It's preparing him," I corrected, "creating the perfect host environment for reproduction and transmission." I pulled out my phone and called the base medical commander. He answered on the first ring. "We have positive identification," I said. "Extremophile organism, integrated at the cellular level, concentrated in respiratory tissue. Transmission becomes viable in—" I checked the countdown. 61 minutes. If Lieutenant Webb had left isolation on schedule, we'd be looking at base-wide exposure by now. Silence on the other end. Then, "I'll inform the Admiral. What's your recommendation for treatment?" I looked at the imaging one more time. The organism had woven itself so thoroughly into Lieutenant Webb's biology that extraction would mean cellular death. But leaving it meant creating a permanent carrier of an organism we didn't understand. "I don't have one yet," I admitted. "But we need CDC confirmation before this goes any further. And we need to know if anyone else on that dive team is showing similar patterns." "I'll make the calls." The line went dead. I stood in the lab, watching the bioluminescent filaments pulse across the monitor in that same 8.3-second rhythm, and realized we'd stopped one transmission event. But the organism was still adapting, still optimizing, still preparing for whatever came next. The countdown hit 0. Atmospheric equilibrium achieved. Lieutenant Webb's perfect vitals finally looked exactly like what they were. A countdown clock that had just reached its endpoint. The CDC arrived 16 hours after confirmation. They brought containment specialists, epidemiologists, and equipment designed for threats that shouldn't exist outside maximum security laboratories. Lieutenant Webb remained in isolation while they ran tests I didn't have clearance to observe. The results came back 48 hours later, sealed in a classification level I'd never seen before. What I did learn came through the base medical commander in a conversation that felt more like a debriefing than a consultation. The organism was neutralizable, not through antibiotics or antivirals, but through controlled atmospheric manipulation. By gradually increasing pressure while decreasing oxygen concentration over a 14-day cycle, they could reverse the organism's adaptation process, forcing it back into a dormant state that the body's immune system could finally recognize and eliminate. Lieutenant Webb underwent the treatment in a hyperbaric chamber modified for the protocol. I watched his vitals through the isolation ward monitors, and for the first time since his admission, I saw them behave like human physiology. His heart rate varied. His blood pressure responded to position changes. His respiratory rate shifted with activity level. The perfect 8.3-second rhythm dissolved into beautiful, chaotic normalcy. 6 weeks later, he walked out of the facility, not on schedule, not with press coverage, but alive and human in ways that mattered more than any discharge ceremony. His cellular function had returned to baseline. The filament networks had degraded. The bioluminescent markers had faded. The organism had been neutralized without destroying the host it had tried to optimize. The Navy updated deep-sea protocols, new screening procedures for returning divers, mandatory telemetry analysis for anyone exposed to unidentified biological material, training modules on recognizing synthetic rhythm patterns and vital signs. The changes were implemented quietly, without acknowledgement of why they were necessary. I returned to my normal rotation 3 weeks after the lockdown ended. The formal reprimand arrived the same day. Breach of protocol, unauthorized escalation, failure to follow chain of command. It went into my permanent record alongside a classified commendation I wasn't allowed to discuss. The institutional cost was paid. The technical justice was served. But late at night, when the hospital settled into its usual rhythm, I found myself reviewing telemetry from other cases, watching for patterns that shouldn't exist, looking for that geometric wrongness that most people miss because they're trained to see health as a destination rather than a process. 2 months after Lieutenant Webb's discharge, A case crossed my desk. Different patient, different circumstances, but the same 8.3-second rhythm hiding in the data. I pulled the full workup before anyone else noticed, ran the analysis, made the calls. This time, nobody questioned the quarantine order. The isolation ward doors sealed with a pneumatic kiss. Through the window, I watched monitors display vitals that finally looked human again. Messy, imperfect, alive. Perfect isn't a medical outcome. It's a warning sign. When biology operates in fixed loops instead of dynamic ranges, something else is writing the code. Subscribe for more forensic investigations into the mechanics of medical truth.